Welcome to Psych Health and Safety in Canada. I'm your host, Marianne Baton, and my guest today is Jason Lauriston. Jason is going to talk to us about leadership. He's going to talk to us about compassion in the workplace. Imagine that. And let's get started. So welcome, Jason. I thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about the work that you do, but I'm especially interested in your concept around the future of work. What do you think is changing?
Well, I think a lot is changing, and it's a long overdue change. I think I'm really optimistic, honestly. In spite of the fact that I know there's a lot of pain out there and a lot of people are struggling and there's been a lot of disruption and a lot of chaos in the workplace, and a lot of people are tired and burnt out. I think we really needed this. We really needed this sort of reset because we've been propelled into, I think, a future of work where we likely should have been, or at least towards a future of work that we likely should have been. And that's going to be defined, ironically, I think it's going to be defined very much at least the next leg of the journey is very much going to be about getting a deep understanding of the importance of individual employee well-being and the role that that plays in unlocking our capabilities for performance and creativity and innovation and all the things we're trying to create. I think that's a big part of the work, and I say ironically, because what were we freaking out about before the pandemic got here? It was all about AI replacing all of our jobs. And I think certainly there's going to be some of that coming at some point. But I think it's the next leg of this journey is much more about unlocking the human side of work than it is about worrying about AI replacing the humans.
Yeah. So, Jason, what do you say to the leaders who go, employee well-being is their business. I'm paying them to do a job?
Well, that's a really good and loaded question. I would say, I ask them to think about, I think well-being is one of those things that we have been overlooking for decades in terms of understanding what it's really about and what it means. And so oftentimes in that conversation, I challenge people to think about, or I invite them to think about the last time that they were sick, like had a cold or had the flu or had a migraine or whatever it is. And they didn't feel like they could shut down. They had to work because of whatever reason. They feel they're indispensable or they had to be at a meeting or whatever. And they worked while they were sick. And I asked them, what was your performance like that day? And invariably what people will, they recognize, like, on the days that you're sick, it takes you twice or three times as long to do work that's half as good. And it's hard. And so I'm like, that is the most simple way that I can illustrate the impact of well-being. It's like, well, your well-being was diminished. And what that means is that your capability to perform in just the way that you normally would was diminished, much less you were way, way, way far away from being at your best that day. And that's just one tiny slice of well-being. That's physical health. When you start getting into mental health, you start getting into financial and emotional and all the other dimensions of well-being around that. And you start to help them understand, like, I tell stories too about my own experience. Like I had a starter marriage in my early 20s. And I remember when my marriage was coming apart, like when I realized what was happening, like it wrecked me for several days. Like I knew that I couldn't work. And so I didn't go to work. Or when we were my wife and I were going through fertility challenges and we didn't think we were going to be able to get pregnant the old fashioned way, or even through fertility, using fertility means. It was devastating and it wrecked me and my ability to perform. And so, all of these things, when you help people start to actually get inside of what it actually means when we're talking about well-being, and then you ask them to reflect on when they were at those places, how that impacted their ability to show up at work, it becomes pretty clear. I mean, that this is an employee performance conversation. It's not about touchy-feely stuff. It's not about kumbaya. It is about employee performance. And if you want your employees to perform at their best, then you have to care about well-being, because if you don't, it's at your own detriment.
Well, with the advantage of hindsight,
Mm-hmm.
what could or should your employer have done when you were going through those really difficult times?
Well, I mean, I think thankfully for me, and I guess good or bad, I was in a, I took days off. I just called in sick for most of those times. But I think had I had a manager who was really dialed into what was going on in my life, this was, I grew up in business in an era where, management was the prevailing wisdom that we were teaching, or wisdom guidance that we were giving managers was, you keep all your employees, you teach employees to keep all their personal drama at home. Work is work, personal life is personal life. And so, most managers went out of their way not to know anything about what was going on outside of work. And especially if it was drama related to your, your marriage or anything else going on. And so I think, when you look at it today and you think about what does management in this new era of supporting well-being looks like, it's a manager who's checking in with me as a person, as a human being, to see how I'm doing. And over time, because they're doing that consistently and listening, we build trust. So when I was starting to see that this was happening, I could have, they would know, and I would have been sharing with them what was going on, and they could have helped, encouraged me to make some room to do whatever I needed to do, or maybe connected me to an EAP, so I could get, some resources for marital counseling, or just for counseling for me to get through it. Like, there's a whole range of things that manager or those managers could have done at that time, but it was not something that was in the water at the time. It just wasn't part of how management was done back in the day.
Right. Right. And now you do a lot of talking about employee well-being and how organizations can support it. Can you talk a little bit about what you share when you're doing your public speaking and your writing?
Sure. I also, actually this year, over the last year, I've actually launched a management training company, because I feel like it's so important that we reskill managers if we're going to do this, because the reality is that we can't, that managers are on the front line of this. The managers are the ones that can make an outsized impact. They're sort of, they are the face of the employee experience to employees in most organizations. And and the unfair part of it for most managers is, not only have they never been prepared to exist in this world that we're in now, we're asking them to, I heard a colleague of mine who is one of the leaders at the Wellness Council of America, WellCoA, talking, and she was talking about mental health, and she had this great phrase she used, that as leaders, as organizations, as managers, we've been telling employees, like, hey, if you're struggling, you can reach out for help. And she's like, that is not the right answer. She's like, we have the responsibility to reach in. Like, that is the frontier that's going forward. And so that's really what I think where we're at, is that managers have never been taught to reach in, and they're very uncomfortable. In fact, we've told them not to do that, right? Because HR and training, we've conditioned managers in a way to manage risk. And when you get involved in employees' personal lives, we've always deemed that as being risky to the organization. We have to change all of that. And so what I have been primarily, the message, there's a lot of, I do whole trainings on this, and so we could talk a lot about it. But I would say that the biggest thing that I have been preaching this year, that I've been talking about this year, I've been writing about, is is that there's sort of this magic thing that I'm going to say magic because it's so powerful. If you learn it, if you develop it, if you lean into it, to help you do this work well. And it is something we never talk about at work, and that is compassion. Compassion is something maybe you hear about in your spiritual practice, or maybe you've heard about it elsewhere, but compassion is not something we talk about at work. But when you understand that compassion sort of describes our particular reaction to suffering in other human beings. And so a compassionate response is one that, psychologists have studied this. A compassionate response requires that you notice that someone else is suffering, that you care that they are suffering, that you have a desire or an intention for them not to be in suffering. And then you're moved to a readiness to take action, to do something about it, to help get them out of suffering. And that to me it describes exactly what we need managers to be doing. We need managers to do a better job of noticing what's going on with their employees, because when you understand well-being, when your well-being is off, when you are struggling, is diminished, whether that's, my physical health, my mental health, I'm financially struggling. I'm in, like my spouse got laid off from their job or whatever, and we're financially stressed. I've got an elderly parent who is got dementia and I'm having to care for them, or I've got kids that I'm having to support in a way that I've never, I've got all this stuff. Our relationship is struggling, all those things. Anytime those dimensions of well-being in our lives are diminished, are not optimal, we are struggling. It causes suffering, it causes pain, it causes all sorts of discomfort. And so as a manager, we have to notice, we have to be in the mode of noticing that. And that requires that we care, as a fundamental thing. And so I think compassion is a really, really fertile opportunity for organizations and for managers to really up their game around this, learning what it is, learning to practice it. It's something that you can learn. And organizationally, one of the very first steps you have to take in order to unleash this power is you have to give your managers permission to care for their people in a way that they haven't in the past. That's been sort of the biggest eye-opener for me as I've gotten into this work, as I've talked to people and been training, is how many managers sort of have this instinct of what to do. Compassion's a natural human instinct that we're all born with, and then we sort of unlearn it. But we have this instinct that we want to help. But most managers have gotten the message very clearly from their organization that you're not to get involved in employees' personal lives. That is not your job. And so until we give them permission to reach in, they're not going to do it. So it starts with permission. So there's a whole bunch of stuff we can do, but that's kind of where I think that the really valuable stuff starts.
It's so fascinating to me, Jason, because I started in this field, workplace mental health, psychological health and safety, in 2004. And we were very specifically avoiding the word compassion because it turned people off. The old school method of management had no room for compassion. So we talked, and it's just so funny, the alignment with what you're saying. Instead of saying compassionate, we say you need to notice what somebody's dealing with. You need to ask how you can help, and then you need to take action, which is almost identical to what you're saying, only we have evolved enough that we can use the word compassion without it creating a visceral reaction among the old school leaders and managers. But there's still we just did a survey with Mental Health Research Canada of leaders in Canada, and their number one discomfort was dealing with employees' emotions. Yep. And that makes sense because they're not recruited or trained or promoted because of their ability to deal with emotions in most cases. Yep. And how do you help those people, they're not good at dealing with their own emotions. They're not good at dealing with their family's emotions. And now here you are saying, but I want you to be compassionate to your employees' emotions.
Yeah, I think that's the $1,000,000 question in the sense of what the frontier is. And I think, so I'm going to back up a step. One of the foundational things that underlies the work that I do. So I've been studying or doing the work of employee engagement as an HR executive internally, and then as a researcher, and I've been writing about it for years. But along the way, one of the things that I realized was that all of the data that we have about how employees experience work suggests that they experience work more like a relationship than they do anything else. They need to feel valued and trusted and accepted and cared for and all of that. So employees, so in a very real sense, it's like the entire work experience is a relationship, and relationships are, as you know, personal life, any kind of relationship is charged and defined by emotions. I mean, we're emotional creatures. And so what I came to realize over the years is that so much of the work that we have to do, and so much of the work that I'm increasingly called to do in my work and in my training, is teaching people the skills, the core skills of relationships. And so part of that is, how do you have better conversations? How do you, how do you build trust in a way that allows for more, sort of take some of the threat, some of the hypercharged kind of reaction out of when an emotion comes up. Because so much of what makes emotions in the workplace feel so daunting and threatening, in particular in the workplace, is because we haven't built trust. We haven't established a foundation of trust in our relationship. And so when you're reacting emotionally, I don't have a baseline under which to, there's not that sort of solid foundation of relationship in place for me to be able to diffuse my reaction to your emotion. Whereas like when my wife is having a bad day, she's had, like she had a bunch of, she maybe had some bad meetings or something happened, and then she's reacting, that emotion is coming to me because I'm the safe place, right? She's letting this emotion out, or maybe she reacts to something. Like, I don't feel that our relationship is threatened when that emotion happens, which makes it easier for me then to sort of absorb it. Hopefully I don't react to it. Sometimes I do, but even when I do, we're both able to say, what is going on? Like, we need to take a breath. Let's step back. Let's talk. Like, how was your day? Like, let's start there. Like, how are you? What's going on? What's underneath this? And then we can get to it. We can have a conversation. And so I think so much of it is about, we have to give managers a different toolkit. We have to equip them for how to have a different kind of conversation. We have to equip them with higher levels of, I'll call it sort of emotional fluency, maybe. Being able to understand that. I think also, there's a reason that we're seeing a rise of, and this is another thing I'm really excited about, is you're seeing a rise of an increase in accessibility of coaching to individuals. There's all these coaching companies that are exploding. There's all of these companies. So they're trying to democratize coaching, making it easier to access. The same thing is happening around mental health support and counseling through, and it's not always going to be perfect, but I mean, that's part of the scaling processes, but we're making it more available to people to be able to access that. I think, there's just a lot of things that are happening that are making it easier for people to, for both people, individuals, and organizations, to provide support and resources to the managers and leaders. And I think also the other thing that's on the rise, which is really helpful in this, is awareness about mindfulness. And, you're seeing more organizations teach at least sort of basic mindfulness techniques so that we can equip managers and leaders and hopefully employees with the tools to, be in better touch, be more aware of their own emotional state when they're showing up in a conversation or whatever, just being able to check that. I know that's been profoundly valuable to me. So I think there's all these trends that are really positive. That's why organizations should be paying attention to that, is because these are the kinds of skills that our managers are going to need in order to support employees going forward. And it's increasingly not something that's a nice to do. It's something that employees are going to expect. They're going to expect a manager that they can sit down with and say, I'm really struggling right now, and it doesn't have anything to do with my job. I'm going to have trouble getting this done because this other thing's going on. And they're going to expect to be able to have that conversation with their manager.
I was just heard the statistic that by next year, we could have up to 75% millennials in the workplace. And as the mother of a millennial, we taught them to be in charge of their emotions. We taught them to be able to speak about it and to expect that people would treat them decently and that they would treat people decently. So it's not a surprise to me that this is going to be the expectation. But I think, Jason, that, somebody who was fixing cars 30 years ago isn't going to be qualified unless they've been upgraded to fix cars today. People that were building airplanes or, doing any type of work 30 years ago can't use that same skill set. And yet some of our managers think that the way that they've managed for the last couple of decades is the way they can continue to manage. And I think you make a really good point that whether they like that or not, it's not going to work for them. And so I think about the fact that many of these managers will be negatively impacted and stressed. So it's in their best interest. But you think about 20 years ago saying to a manager, well, you need to learn mindfulness and you need to be compassionate. It just would not have flown at all. No. You would have been laughed out. I had somebody call me a granola crunching Birkenstock wearing do-gooder when I was talking about some of these things early on. And I'm really not that thrilled with granola. So I don't know, but
you know what? I've just embraced it on some level. Like I jokingly say that I'm, the longer that I'm in this work, the more that I'm evolving into being like the workplace hippie. That's like, I'm just embracing it. Like I'm good with like, it's like, it's all about love, man. At the end of the day, it's all about love. And that is increasingly what is emerging. And that's where, the fundamental insight of recognizing that work is a relationship for employees, I think is transformative, because when you can wrap your head around that, and then we start saying, and you can see it everywhere, right? Once you see that, you can't unsee it, because you start to realize like, wow, that is really true. Like, you think about employees when they feel like their relationship's out of whack at work, whether it be with their manager, whether it be with, I'm not being appreciated, or I'm not being heard, or I don't trust the people around me, their work product decreases, or they power through and they just look for a better relationship, right? They break up with you and they go find somebody that will treat them better. And so when you start to see that everywhere, then we start to realize, okay, this is about teaching these better relationship skills, which is amazing, or it's developing better relationship skills. And the harsh reality that you hinted at, I think earlier when you said, they don't do well with the emotions of their family. Like we're not good at relationships. On the average, we have not been taught great relationship skills. And so that's an uphill battle. It's not a thing that we can just say, okay, great, just use the relationship skills that you would use at home. And it's like, well, the reality is they're not treating their family a lot better than they're treating the people that they're managing. And that has consequences too. And so I would say yes. And so the upside, the beautiful part of the work that we have ahead of us is that as we do this work, as we create a more human workplace, as we create more emotionally fluent managers who understand, or are able to have these conversations, guess what? They will take that home and have better conversations with their partners and their kids and their neighbors and their parents and their everybody around them. Their lives will improve. That's the amazing part of well-being, is that when we help elevate well-being through work, it sends this ripple wave through their entire life, which is, I mean, that is why I do this work. I mean, yes, I love making work better and all that, but in the end, when you make work better, you're making other people really rich. The real payoff for me is that when we make work better for that employee, they're able to do what they need to do at work to satisfy the organization, and everybody wins there. But then they go home and they can live a better life. The stuff that really matters starts to get better. And so there's such an optimistic, positive upside in this when we start to do this right. But it requires I think a very fundamental rethinking about how we equip our managers. And like, I am super sympathetic to managers. I mean, being a middle manager in the corporate world, I think, is one of the hardest and least rewarding jobs that there is in any organization, because you get blamed from all directions when things don't go right. If you're lucky, to use your analogy, if you're lucky, you were trained to fix that car at some point when you got that job. But we have a whole lot of people that were just thrown into the mechanic job and were never given training. They're like, well, you've driven a car before, surely you know how to fix it. And so they never even had a baseline. So they've just learned from, a long line of experiencing bad management from other people, and that's all they have. So then they're repeating that, and this cycle of dysfunction continues. And so when we start to lift them up and give them some love and give them the tools they need to show up differently, we're interrupting sort of a long repeating cycle of management practices that just aren't doing it. And I get excited about that, because I think once we interrupt the cycle, everything can change.
Yeah. I've been called in on cases where the discussion is that there's an employee with a mental health issue. Mm-hmm. But when I speak to the manager, I understand their mental health is more at risk than the employee that I was called to help. And it's just the stress of wanting to do the right thing, wanting to be helpful, but it backfires, and they're left traumatized because they don't know what they could have or should have done. They just know that it's not been effective. And we get a lot of leaders with imposter syndrome, thinking, well, why was I put in this job as a manager when I don't have any idea how to manage people? I don't know how to manage myself. So I get accused a lot, Jason, of being practical. And so I'm wondering if you're speaking to that manager who has good intentions, but they just know they have a dysfunctional team, they're fear-based, they don't trust each other. What would be the steps that you'd advise that manager to take?
That's a great question. And it's a hard question to answer without more context, but I'm going to make some assumptions. So hopefully whoever, listening, just take this with a grain of salt. But I think the first thing is, I always is like, you've got to check in, especially right now, check in with yourself. And that is, how are you doing, really, right? Giving yourself a little time to think about where you're at, because the work you just described, if you've got a dysfunctional team, or you've got a team that's really not working, or maybe your team used to be in person and now they're all spread out and remote, and you're struggling with how to connect and stay on top of that, and there's all a whole bunch of things, is if you, that's a hard challenge, right? That's going to require a lot of work and a lot of effort. So number one is you've got to check in with yourself. You've got to practice some self-care and make sure that you are, that you have your best capacity and capabilities at hand to do this work, because managing is hard. And if I hate this analogy because it's overused, but it's just the best analogy that there is. It's sort, when they tell you on the airplane, put on your oxygen mask before you assist others, because, the reality of that is if you're passed out, you can't help anyone else. So if you can't breathe, and you're not of any use to anybody around you. So you've got to make sure that you're caring for you. And in most organizations, we do a very poor job. We're very concerned about engaging employees. And so we're talking about that all the time. We want to make sure our employees are engaged, but we're not nearly as good at checking in on our managers and making sure they're okay. And so if you want to be a successful manager, you have to prioritize you, and you've got to make sure that you're taking care of you first. The other important part of that is that in the work of well-being, as you start to step into this work with your team, it's hard to have any credibility with your team when you start talking with them about well-being and about the things they need to do to care for their own well-being, when they look at you and say, really? Like, when's the last time you took a vacation? Or how's your sleep? Or, you name it. And so I think to have credibility, you have to, start with you first, lead through your examples. I think that's a big place to really jump off, is that you can be the example. And when you start investing in your well-being, and you need to do this out, like I've been talking about on my blog this year, I've written about, I've had my first kind of pretty serious experience with burnout in the summer of 2020. And I wrote about that. I've been making a very intentional commitment to living my mental health out loud. And out loud for me means through my speaking, through my writing, through whatever, because when I do that, I get all sorts of reactions from my audience, from the people that follow me and subscribe to my stuff, saying, oh my God, thank you for putting this out there. I feel exactly the same way. And so then I'm talking also about what I'm doing, and I'm sort of modeling it. And then that gives them some kind of permission to be like, oh, that's what I need to do. And I think as managers, that's a really big opportunity. So that would be where I'd start. Now, there's a whole bunch of other things that we could talk about after that, but I think in this day and age right now, that's probably one of the most important things and powerful things that you can do.
Well, what you're talking about, Jason, is authenticity, and that you genuinely share both your successes and your challenges. And that, to me, is what great leadership is. Brené Brown talks about vulnerability. Vulnerability is the new superpower strength, right?
Sure.
And for you to experience burnout and then be able to talk about it validates and normalizes that all of us who are passionate about life, about work, can have poor boundaries and can burn out. That's not the issue. The issue is, then what do you do about it, and how genuine can you be? Did it ever occur to you that you didn't want to share, that you wanted to appear invincible?
Probably not for me, just because, it's interesting that you raise authenticity. I have been speaking about and writing about authenticity for probably a decade. And I have found that, authenticity truly is a superpower when you can arrive in your life authentically and really know who you are, know why you're here, know what kind of impact you're trying to have on the world, and then be willing to show up that way. That is so freeing. It's such a liberation, and it's so powerful at any level. And so I've had a sort of conscious commitment to live in authenticity. And I've learned over the years too, I've been practicing, I'm a Brené Brown disciple as well. And I remember the first time I heard her talking about that, vulnerability is the other side of the courage coin. There can be no courage without vulnerability. And so I started practicing vulnerability with great intention. Because that's what it felt like to be courageous. I had to get there. So I've been practicing. So that made sense to me. And I felt a calling to when I struggle, and selfishly, it's kind of a Pavlovian thing for me a little bit. Anytime I show up with vulnerability in my work, I am rewarded for it. People, like, there's always a reward. And so that's the funny part of this. And I try to help people with this, is like, if you can find your way to that, try it just a little. You'll be like amazed when you show a little bit of vulnerability to your team. The response you will get will be likely pretty amazing. They'll be like, oh my goodness, thank you for sharing that. You'll hear that, and then you get reinforcement, and then you go a little further and a little further and a little further and a little further, and then pretty soon you realize, like, there is very little risk.
Yeah,
Usually it's in your head.
Yeah, one of the things that you said is that it's liberating. And when I was in my 20s, it was very much never let them see you sweat, and
Yep.
make sure that you're prepared and that you have all the right things. It's all evidence-based. And I was very stressed out trying to appear that I had it all under control. And as I grew and evolved and realized none of us have it all under control.
Right.
None of us know it all, and it's okay. Life's so much easier. And like you say, people relate more to authenticity than they do to expertise. And it is unfortunate that some leaders don't understand that, because the mask, the armor that they wear to work every day is heavy and distracting. And if they could let go of that, they could lead in a much more conscious way, but also a more effective way.
I completely agree. And it's not their fault, right? Because they've come of age as a leader in a world that's what was rewarded, that's what was taught, that's what was recognized. And to your point, that was even sort of the dominant narrative about how you got ahead. And there's been great cost to that, both for individuals. I think it's come at particularly great cost to women, I think, over the years. And so, and a lot of people just opted out of that. And that's another thing that's beautiful about what's happening. And it's also one of the things that I think is super, like, it's going to be really, really fun to watch the unpacking and all of the research and all of the sort of looking back research that comes out of the pandemic experience. Because, there's just anecdotally, I've had so many conversations with people about the power of, there was such concerns about people being at home or whatever and all these Zoom meetings. But the thing with the Zoom meeting is that, like, when you're in a Zoom meeting and the CEO's up here and these other people, and then you're at whatever level, but like everybody's box is the same size, and there is no head of the table, and and you get to see, like, the CEO might have some kind of distraction or weird thing happen, or they can't figure out how to run their whatever. And it's like, there's been some real shrinking of the distance between human beings at work, because we don't have all of these, visual and sort of structural trappings that signal power differentiation. And so it's like shrunk. And so I think I think a lot of leaders have also have realized, like, this actually feels better to me. Like, I feel like people are actually being honest, or like they'll actually talk to me. Whereas when I walk through the hall in my suit at the office, people would just avoid me. They don't want to be in the elevator with me. Or if I say hi to them, they tense up. Whereas now that, for whatever reason, Zoom is taken a little bit of that out. And so I do think that there's, and I'm not saying this is everywhere, but I do think in some places this experience has actually helped accelerate some of the peeling away of some of that. You don't have to play some of these games as much. Now, I don't know what some of these workplaces, people are going to race back into the, particularly I think like banks and consulting places that are so built on the trappings of power, they'll get back into the office and probably fall right back into it. But I think in a lot of places, we've made some real progress there. And I think that's encouraging. And I mean, to some extent, weirdly, I think Zoom has actually enhanced psychological safety in some places, because it's created some like structural barriers, and it's helped diffuse some power dynamics that were really troubling.
Well, and it does what you said at the very opening, is that we start to see the human rather
Yep.
than just the role. I had somebody say to me that they had worked for their boss for over 5 years, but just realized that they were just human when their dog came running across the screen when they're trying to talk and their child's calling mommy, mommy. And you think, yeah, that's it. You start to see people as people instead of just a role or a cog in a wheel. So I think the Great Reset, it
Yeah.
is a really good term, because I think so many people have rethought their life, have rethought their work, rethought what matters. And I think we've all realized that we can do with a lot less in terms of consumerism, and that work could be something that supports quality of life rather than fights with it.
When I hope that, because all of the things that have happened that Zoom sort of did for us by, I say Zoom, Microsoft Teams, whatever, we're on Zoom. So, but whatever it was, these video meetings did for us, like all of that was available to people before, it was always available. There's all sorts of things. I've been for years talking to managers about how to, or leaders about how to introduce more, humanity into their meetings, or how to show up differently, and been advising leaders from an employee engagement perspective to show more of themselves to their employees, because if their employees can feel like they understand and know them as humans, they can connect to them, they can build more overlap, that creates more trust, and then that trust is really powerful. And so this isn't something that's a new dynamic. It's just, I think the good news is it's sort of by accident, or because we were forced into it, we've had the experience of it now. And so it's going to be, I think, easier going forward to say, hey, do you remember when this happened? This is why that happened, and here's how you can preserve some of that going forward, even when you're back together, if you are working together, to make sure you don't lose that sense of human connection on your team or with your team in the future.
Yeah, to keep the best of what the pandemic brought, and then restart some new things that really are great about being together in person. One of the questions that I like to ask, Jason, because we have a formal definition of psychological health and safety in the workplace, but I like to ask how you would describe it to somebody who doesn't know what the concept means. Can you give it a shot?
Sure. Well, the way that I would, if somebody, if I said psychological safety to someone and they looked at me like, they're like, what are you talking about? I would say, it's the ability for an employee to say the thing that needs to be said, or that they want to say out loud, without fear of consequence.
Mm-hmm.
That's about as simple as I could put it.
Yeah. Martin Shane calls that safe voice. I'm safe to speak up. So what would you say then to the employers who say, I don't want everybody speaking up, I want them just to do their job?
Good luck with that. I think, you know what, that is a decision you can make. I think it's extraordinarily high risk now. I could talk about all of the, like, you're losing so much. There's so many people that see obvious things that would benefit the organization, that would benefit your customers, that just aren't going to say it because they don't trust the people around them, or they're not, they're worried about what will happen if they say the thing that feels uncomfortable, or that, their fear of backlash or whatever, or they can't speak up about their being underpaid, or that their male colleague is making $10,000 a year more than they are and they're more qualified. They won't say that. all of those things. Like I could talk about all of that, but the reality in today's world, especially with the Great Reset, the Great Resignation, the Great whatever it is when the pandemic showed up and cracked all of this open, especially for people who, have extraordinarily expensive, skill sets that are very portable, their world opened up, right? There's more, they have more job opportunities now without having to move by a factor of 10 or 20. And so, you can play it out however you want. You can create an unsafe work environment, but people aren't going to tolerate it. And it's easier than it has ever been in history for them to find a different place that isn't going to make them feel that way on a day-to-day basis. So like I said, good luck with that.
Yeah. So it's not about being nice. It's not about being a new age hippie. It
No.
is a good business decision now
It
to,
is.
to give employees safe voice to be able to hear what's going on before it becomes a crisis. Well,
But I think the Great Resignation, don't you think the Great Resignation is largely happening today? I mean, the quit rates in the US, the month to month quit rates continue to skyrocket. It's like we set a record and then the next month is a record. And I think a lot of that is due to, this is my speculation. And I think there's some data emerging around this, but I think it's because employees were made to feel unsafe in lots of different ways over the course of the pandemic. And then as soon as there was an opportunity to be like, okay, I remember how you made me feel. I remember feeling unsafe, and I'm not going to let you do that to me again. And that feeling, that lack of safety. And I understand there's some groups in the workplace that have never felt safe. But I think what's happened is those of us that are in my sort of demographic group, white cisgender male folks, straight, married, whatever, all the things, we were made to feel unsafe, and perhaps for the first time ever at work, a lot of us. And suddenly it's like, oh, that's what this lack of safety thing feels like. And so I do think we're in an era where we're able to maybe have different kinds of conversations about it moving forward, I hope.
Yes, because when you finally recognize what that experience is, I think you see it differently than if you don't have any idea. It's really interesting to me. We're looking, especially over the next year, at inclusivity and psychological health and safety. And it just, again, blends so well with everything that you're saying. Is if you don't feel safe to speak up, if you don't feel that somebody's got your back, if you do feel like you have to wear a mask all day at work, you don't feel included. You feel excluded. And so I think it'll all tie in beautifully. And I think you're right. I think employers are ready. I think they're more aware of the benefit to them, that it's not just to benefit employees. But if you're right about what you're saying, that this isn't just going to make employees more productive, creative, innovative, hardworking, it's also going to trickle down to communities, to families, then yeah, I think we're perched to make the world a better place.
Yeah, I think work is definitely, I'm really optimistic that like the workplace, the work experience is a device we can use to change the world. When, and it hasn't always been that way, but I think going forward, the way there's so many trends that you look at in the world. And I mean, one that I will give you that I think is most powerful and that represents how big of an opportunity we have in front of us is, the Edelman Trust Barometer is one of my favorite reads annually. It comes out in January. It's Edelman does this study of global trust. For those that aren't familiar with it, they're a consulting firm. They do this global trust study, largest one in the world, and they survey 1,000 people or so from all these different countries to kind of get a sense on how people, like, their trust levels in institutions. And it's really, it's one of those things I would say, like, make sure, pour yourself a glass of wine and sit down and read this, because you're going to need it. It's depressing, because trust has been tanking for the last several years overall. Trust in government, trust in media, trust is not in a good place globally. Shocker, right? Spoiler alert. But the shining light, or sort of the beacon in there that is the opportunity, is that the one institution that is still reasonably highly trusted for people is my employer. And so they want to trust their employer. They have more trust for their employer than they do for the government, than the media, than a lot of other institutions in most cases. And what that means is that we have this not only opportunity, but this obligation to elevate what the role that we play. I think we can, and this is back to teaching, when we, relationship skills and mental health support skills, and all of these things that we're talking about. If we start like thinking differently about what we can do through work, at work, in this way, and our employees are going to trust it coming from us as employers more than they're going to trust it from coming from almost anybody else, we can change the world. But we've got to be, I think there's a window of opportunity that we need to seize.
Yeah. And it's, how do we become, as leaders, as employers, how do we become more trustworthy?
Yeah.
And to start to work on that, and maybe the type of leadership training that you do and what's out there for leaders in a new way of being a transformational leader, a new way of being a conscious leader can help. So, yep. Jason, any last words that you want to share with the listeners?
I would just say that, back to that question about managers and leaders, or if you are someone who supports organizational management leadership, or supports creating the employee experience, or whatever that is just know that, like, this is your window of opportunity. Like, there is a willingness and an openness from leaders and from organizations like I've never seen it in my career, to have conversations about things like compassion and mindfulness and mental health. And like, we have this opportunity, but it's incumbent on us to play big, like come with big ideas, ask for lots of resources, take those resources and put them to use to make real systematic structural changes, invest in your managers in a different way, but like really grab a hold of this moment and do not play small, because this moment will not last. I think we have maybe 12 to 18 months worth of opportunity to really make hay here. And it's time to seize that. So please do so. Please do so. Make that commitment, take big swings, think big thoughts, dream big dreams. And I think you'll see the world's going to meet you in that, because we're ready. The workplace is ready.
Yeah. That's great, Jason. Thank you very much. This entire video will be available on the Flourish DX YouTube channel, and short clips for when you were most brilliant and profound will show up on LinkedIn. And I just invite the audience to connect with either yourself or myself on LinkedIn, and we can continue the conversation. So thanks very much. I really enjoyed this talk.
Thanks for having me.